Alhamdulillah, tonight we begin a new series of, shall we say, lectures, revisiting some of the themes that we have been discussing over the past few lectures, over the past maybe 2 or 3 years now. In fact, if you still remember, or some of you who may have been witness to the first installment, we spoke about looking and cooking at history. That was at Cafe Lapis. It was a module. Back then, basically, the major content of that discussion relied on this book also, Historical Fact and Fiction. Except that tonight, once we begin the series, we're going to look deeper in a more serious way, chapter by chapter. So inshallah tonight, I intend to go through the introduction of the text, but before that, perhaps a brief explanation on this text, the Historical Fact and Fiction, and its author, Professor Ismail Al-Attas. The Historical Fact and Fiction was published in 2011. However, Professor Ismail Al-Attas has been writing about the history of Islam in the Malay world perhaps since the 60s. His first book published was when he was still an undergraduate. That was Sufism Misunderstood and Practice Amongst the Malays. And that book, which is still a very useful guide to both Sufism as well as its understanding and practice in the Malay world, Professor Ismail Al-Attas had already begun his field work, meeting various mashaikh, leaders of the tariqahs. He has also included there the history of Sufism as it began in the early periods, its definition, its major exponents, including the theoretical history of tasawwuf in this part of the world. He already there dealt with the likes of Hamza Mansuri and Nuruddin Al-Raniri, and some of the ideas which we found developed here, like Historical Fact and Fiction, its germinal state is found in that work. Later on, he would pursue this study as part of his master's program. He went on to write about Raniri and the Wujudiyah, or the existentialist philosophers of the 17th century Aceh, going on to write his PhD on the mysticism of Hamza Mansuri. In the conclusion of that work, the mysticism of Hamza Mansuri, published as his PhD thesis, the 2-volume work, there he already wrote about a general idea, a general theory of the Islamization of the Malay archipelago. Meaning to say, at that early instance of his career, he was reading, and he had read the major works in the Jawi script, in the Malayo-Arabic script, and having pondered over, say, maybe a few centuries worth of writing from reading from the works of theology, philosophical mysticism of tasawwuf, reading on the works of religion, as well as books on history and semi-historical nature, gradually he arrived at a general theory of the Islamization of the Malay archipelago, hitherto not yet discussed nor proposed by any scholar before him. And why that theory was not yet proposed before him will be explained in some of his later works, especially the preliminary statement on the Islamization of the Malay archipelago. Now this book, Historical Fact and Fiction, represents the mature contemplation and writing, as well as the discoveries and new discoveries and challenges to some of the asserted conclusions of Orientalist historians of the Malay archipelago. It still has the figure of the Chanticleer, or better known as the rooster, as in its cover. This calligraphy, the basmala, is his own invention. Yes, in 1972, it was used as the cover of his Islam in Malay Culture and History, Islam dalam Sejarah dan Kebudayaan Melayu. And why he puts the Chanticleer as the cover signifies a new era in history. Yes, because the roosters sounding in the morning signifies the coming of the dawn. And so he's putting this as a label, talks about a new era in the history of the Malay archipelago. And why is that so significant, the understanding of a new era in the periodization of history? That is because for every people, for every community, there will be certain momentous and significant event in history before which and after which you're no longer the same person. You're no longer the same community. For Europe, it was perhaps the Carolingian Renaissance, yes, initiated by Charlemagne in about 9th century. Why I say the Carolingian Renaissance, this is relying on the works of Henry Pirenne, the Belgian historian. He put forth at least two decisive factors in which he said the Carolingian Renaissance was the advent of the beginning of a new era in Western history. Because he said, previous to that, Western civilization, or rather the Roman civilization that was the inheritors of the Greek civilization, relied a lot on the Mediterranean Sea for their own source of identity as well as their trade and economics. And say between the 1st century in the Common Era and the 6th century in the Common Era, the condition was more or less similar. What happened though, as a result of the expansion of Islam in history, and it's going northwards and westwards, this expansion gradually secluded and isolated the West or the European peoples from being able to benefit from the Mediterranean Sea. Also, at the same time, it led to the shift of the center or the axis of the Holy Roman Empire, especially the papacy, to the north in France, and thereby legitimating the Frankish king Charles the Great or Charlemagne or Karl the Gross. And their reign already began the transfer of history from Rome as its center to Europe. And from then on, the European people started defining themselves more and more, shall we say, precisely until they reached the age of modernity. Now, for the Malay world, it was the coming of Islam that heralded this new period in history, such that before and after Islam, so transfigured was the condition of the people here, their sense of identity, their language, their religion, their sense of national consciousness, that Islam and its coming to this part of the world was the most momentous event in history. So that's why the coming of Islam is heralded by the Chanticleer, yes, dengan kokokkan ayam jantan, like that, so signaling a new dawn. Anyways, I just want to say or quote what my friend Ikhwan, a mathematician, said about this book. He said that of all the books that Professor Naqib Al-Attas had written, this is the most difficult for him, and I would agree, I suppose, although his other works are not easy either. This is because compared to his writing on, say, metaphysics or his writings on secularism, his writing on history is a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary work. Professor Tatiana, our lecturer in Cassis, who I derive a lot of benefit from, she used to say that the proper study of history is akin to, if you know of the German novelist Hermann Hesse, he wrote a novel on it's called The Glass Bead Game. And it's a novel set in the future in a town called Castilia. In this town or in this city, the people are relieved of economic burdens and relieved of any other sort of burden so that they can focus on intellectual pursuits. And people in this town are, they are absorbed into an academy to master this game. It's called the Glass Bead Game. And this game is so complex that before you can become adept at it, you must be able to master music, mathematics, and a number of the other sciences, because the glass bead game, as it were, synthesizes all the sciences and the arts in order for you to be a master of it. I remember Professor Tatiana, she gave me this vivid description. She said that imagine a chess piece. Yes, it is already sufficiently complex enough, isn't it? Just by the limited movements of the pawn and the rook and the queen and king, you can already consider, the mathematical computations that would be so many different possibilities. But supposing, she said, that now with imagine she has a chess piece in mind in which there are several levels. Yes, that's level 1, level 2, and level 3, or tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. The movements of tier 1 would affect tier 2 and tier 3, vice versa. And imagine if you have to play this at once, she said. Now this is how the study of history is properly done. Because you cannot have this abstraction in which you just focus. For example, if you are a student of nature, it may be multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, supposing if you're a student of zoology and you study animal behavior. But there's limits to it, or the limits are more known in your observations. Even if you were to be one of the more interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary study on the rise now is the cognitive sciences. Even then, in cognitive science, if you limit it at least to the study of the synapses of the brains and even linguistic variants, you don't include there a variable like the human will, which is part and parcel of the study of human history. And the human will, as we know, it can go anyways. So, with regards to understanding Islam in the Malay world, somebody like Professor Naqib Al-Attas, you must imagine he is like a magister ludi, yes, a French word, yes, a magister ludi, meaning to say the master of the game. And this is a play on Huizinga. He wrote a book called Homo Ludens, yes, one work cited by Professor Al-Attas early on. This book, Homo Ludens, study human beings as the playful animal. Yes, he proposed that the human beings is a playful animal that enjoys and revels in play. But the Magister Ludi, therefore, is somebody who masters the game very well, that he understands the various different levels and the various different rules of the game, such that he can explain exactly what happened at what turn. So Professor Naqib Al-Attas, if you see this historical fact and fiction, truly is a master of several disciplines. One of linguistics, Arabic, Islam in its various disciplines like law, philosophy, metaphysics. You will see, for example, in part of his partial solution to a problem, for example, on the dating of the Terengganu inscription. He discovered that the moon being on the constellation of Saratan or on Aries through his reading of Chaucer. Yes, at the Canterbury Tales of Chaucer, that's when he discovered that since these writings is about the same time, it would reflect the same night sky, shall we say. So, multidisciplinary, linguistics, literature, the study of mythology, and so on and so forth. That is why in the early 70s, he proposed an institute, yes, to properly study Malay studies. This would be conceptualized as the IBKKM, Institut Bahasa, Kebangsaan dan Kesusastraan Melayu. This IBKKM would teach students in a 4-year to a 6-year program, depending if you're just doing there for the undergraduate or the graduate program, between 4 to 6 or 7 years, all the disciplines that is required to understand properly, to appreciate properly what happened in Malay history and civilization. And why he was able to conceptualize what is needed in this institute was he was already a practitioner of that. But I'm saying all this not to deter you away from reading this book. I'm rather saying all this to make us appreciate what a great gem we have in the author and what a great gem in the product of his work. It is not a simple work, shall we say, but with some patience and with the tenacity and intensity of willing and able to spend the required time and effort on the book, we may understand a significant aspect of our own history and culture. Furthermore, this book is an essay. Yes, he calls it an essay. But I'm sure what he means by essay is not what we understand in school.
rather perhaps he means in the French signification of an essay, which is a piece of writing manageably small, dedicated to the propagation of a single, powerful and multifaceted idea. A single, powerful and multifaceted idea. Yes? So this essay does just that. Yes? It is pursuit, yes, after pursuit after pursuit, to present to us the beautiful story of the Islamization of the Malay archipelago, the various key players in it, and the rearrangement of so many things that needed to be rearranged. Yes? Also, another perception that we may get, for those of us who have been reading perhaps some of the books of a historical nature or a semi-historical nature, if you know about the historical genre or Malay historiography, if you've been reading from Hikayat Samudra Pasai or Hikayat Raja-Raja Pasai, Hikayat Aceh, Sejarah Melayu and these various other historical works, you would think that what he means by historical fact and fiction is the fact and fiction found in those books, or rather the fictionalized accounts in those books and what are facts behind them. That's one meaning. But the more dominant meaning that he tries to defend in this book is that it is not just the Malay authors who were conscious in presenting a myth, in presenting a story, in presenting an edifying fable with truths behind it. But he's also saying that some of the Orientalist writers, the British and the Dutch historians and their followers, are also guilty of the fact and fiction. However, their fiction is so difficult to sift from the fact, because their fiction is the children of their conjecture, and their conjecture tries to become as similar to reality as it is, such that it escapes our minds that it is in fact conjecture and not history. Yes, there are children of their conjecture that has permeated the teaching of history in this part of the world, that has so shaped and influenced many of our own sense and understanding of history, which is in fact fiction rather than fact. This is more difficult to tell than for example, the story of Malacca and the Sangkancil, the story of Marong Mahawangsa, the story of Merah Silau, yes, the story of the princess in the bamboo tree. All these things, we know its mythological character, but we know that the authors of this book put forward these ideas not because they want to insult our intelligence, but rather because of a certain truth that they want to couch behind it, yes, usually for the purpose of edification. But in the fiction that we have been served by those who adopt and subscribe to the empirical perspective, now this fiction is more difficult to discern, and this is what requires a brilliant genius like Professor Nakib Al-Attas to tell for us, so that history becomes for us a most important and meaningful vocation. So I would like, inshallah, in the coming months to read this book. I cannot afford to read the book line by line, or we will all grow old together reading this book. But we can at least attempt, perhaps maybe one chapter per session. And if you want to dig and delve further into the writings and what is being discussed here, you should come and consult the historians such as Professor Tatiana. I make no claims of being a historian. I'm not even an amateur historian, because an amateur historian would be a person who deals with the multiple disciplines of history that is required. You at least would be introduced to the discipline of numismatics, meaning the study of coins. You would be dealing with manuscripts. You would be studying perhaps different languages and so on. I have no such skills. I am but somebody who used to attend the classes and ask a lot of questions and read these books. More a student of philosophy rather than history. But I just feel that this text is very important to highlight, and I feel like a pizza delivery person. You know, if you like the pizza, you should come to the company, and the company is Cassis. and the real bakers are the likes of Professor Zaini, Professor Tatiana, and these are historians like that you should meet and you should try to benefit in your life. Anyways, this essay, so I read from the historical fact and fiction in the introduction section. This essay was formulated during the few months of my convalescence from a recent accident. In it, I have set forth my interpretation of the story of Merah Silau and that of the founding of Malacca, as well as the identity of the Muslim missionaries of the Malay archipelago who spread Islam in the 12th to 16th centuries. My interpretation differs fundamentally from that which is generally accepted by historians of the Malay world. It is perhaps the first time that such an interpretation has ever been attempted. I may be wrong in some details that have been treated by others, but at least on some other details that have never been clarified, whose importance must not be underestimated, I think I am right. European historians of the Malay archipelago, comprising prehistorians, ethnologists, archaeologists, philologists, sociologists, and other scholars belonging to the social sciences, have meticulously researched and brilliantly elaborated their cogent findings with such diligent and inspiring scholarship that evokes due praise. We must sincerely acknowledge their wonderful intellectual contributions and affirm what is true in their interpretation of our history, which they have gradually set in the crucible agreed among themselves. You see, one thing about Professor Naqib Al-Attas, people who understand him as a caricature, or people who understand him according to sound bites, would think that he's a critique of the West, an unjust critique of the West, that he criticizes everything there is about the West as if there is nothing good about West or the Europeans. But in reality, he is not that. He is not an anti-modern intellectual as represented by some of his detractors. In reality, he knows and he appreciates, as found here, if you read his writings, he always appreciates due labor and he gives praise where it is due. Even in his most recent work in 2015, On Justice and the Nature of Man, where he challenges some conclusions with regards to the nature of man, whereby he disagrees with some aspects of the theory of evolution, in particular on the origins of man, and man being a special creation. Even then, he praised those whose labors ought to be praised. With regards to the European historians of the Malay archipelago, their labors, over the past few centuries, bear in mind that some of them came as government officials, others came as part of the companies that came, but yet their labors are praiseworthy. You look at the dictionaries that they have gathered, for example, like by Winstead. Yes, you will see that R.O. Winstead. Yes, you will see that the vocabulary that he put there in terms of defining many of the terms, we don't find any reason to disagree with him. For example, of the many hundreds, if not thousands of words that he has carefully culled. This was not a time of the internet. That means to say, if somebody wanted to compose a dictionary like Winstead Malay-English Dictionary or English-Malay Dictionary, you would have to painfully read the manuscripts. You would have to read the many works that have been written to gather together there, not just abstract concepts, but things of the mundane, yes, and expressions and found there. Of course, we may disagree, for example, on certain fundamental matters where he might be wrong, like on theology, and others where differences of worldview may, may influence how he gives the definitions. But nevertheless, the fact that he can come up with that and the various histories that he has written is one such praiseworthy element. And so have the others amongst the Orientalists, both the Dutch as well as the British. Yes, they have written marvelous works with regards to this part of the world, in which if we read with an open mind and also a critical apparatus, we can truly benefit, while at the same time not be, confused. But there are certain problems of knowledge and methodology that we must question, which they and their followers from among our own scholars have caused to arise in our understanding of our history. We must question the way they arrive at their theories, their way of reasoning and analysis, their setting forth of premises and arrival at conclusions, their raising of problems and arrival at their solutions, their understanding of recondite matters of meaning, their raising of doubts and ambiguities, and their insistence upon empirical facts. Indeed, they may be right in some of their assumptions and presuppositions, and in some of the answers to the questions that we must raise, but in some they are positively wrong. The starting point of the historians in their attempt to reconstruct history of Islam in the Malay archipelago was the idea that Islam came via the trade routes. Upon this obvious fact, the conclusion was quickly drawn that traders brought and disseminated Islam in this part of the world. The idea was developed into a principle from which practice proceeds. The practice that proceeded from this theory was focused upon matters related to trade and traders, and the reconstruction of historical events pertaining to Islam was erected first within the confines of a branch of social science concerned with the exchange of goods, and later combined to include the study of laws and systems of societies. From this combination, there gradually emerged other related theories, such as the missionary theory, the influence of Sufism theory, the economic theory, the political theory, and the crusader theory, each quite inadequate in providing valid explanation in their reconstruction of historical events pertaining to Islam. Their investigation of historical events was carried out by means of empirical methods, which insist on facts that correspond with what is actual, with what is, regardless of its value. But unlike the facts of economics and the social sciences, which are accessible to direct experience, the facts described by history are past facts which are no longer accessible to direct experience. Yes, his language is also not very easy to understand. But first, we say, with regards to, he's now revealing to us within a very terse and condensed paragraph how history is formulated. The study of history is not something like what is presented in the opinion pieces of journalism. Even then, yes, the journalist has to select, yes, to write on contemporary events, for example. The journalist has to select first a particular frame, and then a particular issue, and of the particular issue, the particular angle through which such a piece is being written. And then, even then, there will be counter opinions and counter ideas. So therefore, what more if we are now talking about, say, 100, 200 and 300 years ago? The further we look into history, the more dim the facts are. Yes, unlike the facts of economics, for example, and the other social sciences, they can rely on surveys. And others, for example, where economics is concerned, in the crudest sense, we can even look at actual activities which might be visible to the naked eye to determine certain economic indicators. I remember when I was still a small boy, my elder brother, he used to say, if you want to know the condition of the economics, the economic situation of the country, he said, you should focus on the highways. He said, the more lorries go up and down, the more economic activity there is. And he tried to show other means, tried to explain, for example, the law of supply and demand and so on. These things can be taught to somebody, and it would be visible, and you can have indicators and checks around it. Similarly, with regards to psychology and other facts of the social sciences in the present. But when it comes to history, we have to rely on records of the past. We have to rely on reports. We have to judge between different records and reports. And furthermore, especially the challenge would emerge when it comes to a people whose understanding of history and the present and whose understanding of time differ markedly from our present modern chronological understanding of time. For example, if you read in some of the historical records of the Malays, two events which are apart in history may be joined together because of the significance of one over the other. For example, we know Professor Al-Attas gives in his study of Nuruddin Ar-Raniri, Ar-Raniri's time in one of the records was said to be with an earlier sultan because of his significance. Yes, not because of the time frame like that. It wasn't like a recitation of date or chronology. So there are many things that needs to be done by the history. So that means to say history relies, it is insufficient to just look at raw facts, raw empirical facts. but there needs to be also the mind of the historian to be able to arrange things in proper historic and chronological fashion. Yes. It is true that some traces of the past are found in the present, such as documents, official registers, records of events, stone inscriptions, manuscripts, coins, buildings, various implements and the like, which are the necessary materials from which historians derive their data to reconstruct the past. But the reconstruction of past facts as well as present facts cannot be conducted accurately regardless of value. For a fact is not only what is, it includes also what follows from it by way of explanation. I think if I go on in this manner, it will be doing injustice to the gathering. So I would rather proceed by highlighting, I suppose, the most important aspects of the introduction. So I have explained about how history is cooked, how history is produced, and with regards to the history of the Malay world, since you have so many of these Orientalists who come here with their insistence on empirical facts, there are certain parts of the history we will find, for example, that the documents and the registers began, shall we say, in the 15th and the 16th centuries when the Portuguese came, because they are more careful in their reports, their registers and so on. Similarly, when the Dutch took over, and then gradually when the British took over, some of the more detailed aspects of this Malay archipelago was now recorded. However, while this is true, there are, on the other hand, the Malay chronicles. There are, on the other hand, the historical or the Malay historiography. That means to say the Malay writings in themselves that can also serve as, shall we say, sources of history. And furthermore, since the Malay archipelago is so strategically located geographically, you will have also reports from people in China, you will have reports from people in India, and you have reports from Ibn Battuta, and you have reports from Arabia, like the one in Muruj al-Zahab, the Golden Meadow by Al-Mas'udi. So the major geographers and historians in the Abbasid period, for example, would have records of this part of the world. They would be recording their trades, and they would be recording the products that are found in this part of the world. So therefore, the careful mind of a historian like Professor Naqib Al-Attas can sieve through all these records and gradually construct a picture of what was happening. Now, he's saying that the historians coming from Europe, yes, from the various disciplines, have contributed immensely. But there are certain limitations. And these limitations may be the source of the critique of the likes of Edward Said when he criticized Orientalism. But Professor Naqib Al-Attas, like his late brother Professor Hussein Al-Attas, is looking at a very specific aspect of the Orientalist act and not the generality of Orientalism per se, that may influence their proposition of theories and facts. Now, with regards to the history of Islam in the Malay archipelago, some of the things that influence the way they judge Islam here is first a taint of settled aversion against Islam, which is very difficult to remove, especially during those times. They were still, at that time, in the 19th and the 18th century, was still in a competitive mood, a competitive mode against the Turks, the Ottomans. And earlier on, yes, the expansion of Islam into Europe, which came with the sword also in certain parts, and the continuous battles, at least in the Frankish consciousness, left a harrowing experience in their mind. So this taint of settled aversion against Islam, coupled with their preference for India, would lead them to look at this part of the world as part and parcel of greater India. And also, since a lot of them were trained in archaeology, anthropology, ethnology, they tend to prefer also the more exotic aspects. And so therefore, between the Javanese and the Malay kingdoms, yes, which both occupy close lands, the preponderance is towards the Javanese. So that is why they try to present even Islam as a thin veneer. Yes, like a very macam kulit tipis like that, a thin veneer that you scratch, and what is found inside is the Hindu-Buddhist worldview. Also, the autochthonous. So their studies, for example, tend to highlight the role of the shaman, the magicians, the bomos, and the tok batins. These mystical aspects of the Malay people are what they are interested in. But something interesting that I remember in my last conversation with Prof. Tatiana about the preponderance of the bomos amongst the Malay people is not a reflection necessarily of their mystical worldview or of their belief in mythological things, but rather it is because of their secular nature. Yes, secular, in the sense that secular means a preference for the here and now, and the lack of belief in anything beyond this world. They wanted a quick solution to their business problems. They wanted a quick solution to their marital problems. They wanted a quick solution to their success issues. So therefore they went to the Bomo because that offered and promised them quick solutions. Yes, not necessarily because they believe in the magical powers, but they are going there. It's like a competition between the science and the witch doctors, and whoever gives them results is where they go to. So it is not necessarily a function of their magical worldview. On the other hand, the coming of Islam in the Malay archipelago, which came in the course of centuries, yes, and the coming of Islam, which came with its teachings, and the coming of Islam, which elevated one of the languages of the people. Now these things, it's more difficult to discern if already, to begin with, when you study this part of the world, you're already focused on that aspect. Now that's one. Secondly, as he was pointing out in the paragraph we read, when it comes to their conclusions or their starting point, they have been focusing on the fact that since Islam came via trade routes, they made the logical jump that since it came via trade routes or trade routes, the ones who brought Islam here must have been traders. And so they built this as a principle upon which another theory is built, upon which another theory is built. And that's what he was saying, that they gradually agreed it as a crucible amongst themselves. Now these things, once they become a theory in the scientific sense of the word, in the sense that one theory is premised upon another theory and premised upon another theory, will render then the logical conclusions to be all these other theories that explains the coming of Islam into the Malay archipelago. But since they are writing without just cause, as Professor Naqib was saying, a relook by a person with a more careful and a better appreciation and understanding of the linguistic aspect, the religious aspect, the metaphysical aspect, and more importantly, by looking at the very manuscripts that were written, and by looking at the things which were, rather than fiction, a different presentation of the facts, can yield a different conception of history. And this different conception of history is not merely an alternative conception, such that you either go to this camp or that camp. This second, or rather this alternative conception of history has greater credibility towards truth because of factor A, B, C, and D. And it can explain many more aspects of how we understand ourselves and how we understand our history. I would also, however, still like to read the definition of Islamic civilization, because I think it is important for us to imbibe this. A definition of Islamic civilization has never been attempted by them, even though they often write about it without just cause. I define Islamic civilization as a civilization that emerges among the diversity of cultures of Muslim peoples of the world as a result of the permeation of the basic elements of the religion of Islam, which those peoples have caused to emerge from within themselves. The process by which such emergence comes about is called Islamization, which is the liberation first from magical, mythical, animistic, and ethnic cultural tradition incompatible with Islam, and then from secular control over one's reason and one's language. Whatever basic and praiseworthy elements of the pre-Islamic civilization that bind people together and are accepted as compatible with Islam become part of Islamic civilization. So you see, this is an amazing fact of Islamic history. Islam, from the Quran, accepts the reality of difference. Cultural, linguistic difference is part of the signs of God. Yes, because Allah Himself said, "Ja'alnakum min syu'uban wa qabaila lita'arafu." Yes, indeed we have created you from male and female, and then we brought you as tribes and peoples in order that you may come to know each other. Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. Indeed, the one who is most praiseworthy amongst you, or the most honored among you, is the one who has greatest piety or fear or consciousness of Allah. So therefore, the multiplicity of cultures, the multiplicity of language, the multiplicity of ways of life, these are all, wherever they are found not incompatible with Islam, they are accepted. So that is why you have, when Islam came to the Indian or the subcontinent, you will see there a mode of practice of Islam which is not incompatible with the essential teachings of the Prophet, but yet reflecting something truly Indian in the practice and culture. It selected, the missionaries who went there selected one of the languages that was available there. They selected what would become Urdu, and in that language, while maintaining most of the vocabulary of the peoples, infused it with certain key terms from the Quran and changing certain key meanings from key concepts of that language. Similarly, with the Turks, yes, with the Ottomans, with the Persians, even with the Chinese. I mean, the Uyghurs today, for example, especially in the 16th and 17th century, we will find that some of our scholars, especially coming from the Ibn Arabi tradition, they were trying to deal with the Confucius, the ideas of Confucius, and try to assimilate the ideas of Confucius that did not run contrary to the ideas and the worldview of Islam. And in this part of the world, of the languages that are found, because multiple languages are spoken throughout the Malay archipelago, there are thousands of islands. And of these thousands of islands, just look at the miracle that when Islam came, all these islands, yes, became Islamized, whilst at the same time they spoke now a lingua franca, which is the Malay language, a relatively undeveloped language, which they would then develop as a result of the process of Islamization. Now this language, the relatively undeveloped language, when it came to assimilate, absorb, imbibe terms from the Islamic languages, from Persian, from Arabic, from the Islamic disciplines, kalam, tasawwuf, falsafah Islamiyah, from fiqh, it really enriched the language. And furthermore, this force would also allow for this language to absorb from the nearby languages, from the best words of the nearby languages. You will find, for example, in the 16th century, in the writings of Hamzah Fansuri, certain words from the language of the Malays of Pasai. In Abdul Rauf Singkil, yes, he said that since his grasp of the Malay language was not up to par, he checked it with the masters of the language from Pasai also. You will have, for example, amongst the northerners, yes, the people from Terengganu, Kedah, they will have certain vocabularies in their written pieces. In the writings of Sheikh Daud bin Abdullah Al-Fatani, for example, will be found certain vocabularies which is peculiar to the people in the north. There are certain vocabularies found amongst the people in in Palembang, in Riau, in Johor, would be different from elsewhere. But all in all, yes. But all in all, there was gradually an emerging new civilization. And this civilization, these people cannot be said to be the same people as they were before. Because their sense of consciousness is different. Their sense of the world is different. Their sense of the self is different. Now the concept of the self becomes highly abstract. They understand now that the self is not merely a flesh and bone, but rather that the flesh and bone houses a spirit, and this spirit undergoes processes. And furthermore, they understand at the center of their worldview is the conception of God, the teachings of Tawheed, and they understand religion as deen, as agama in the Malay language. So you see that the coming of Islam into this part of the Malay archipelago brought about this sense of national consciousness. And furthermore, there were new institutions that came about. That's why me and Abdul Rahman, we chose as the title of this series, the Sowers, the Tillers, and the Kingdoms of the Malay archipelago. The Sowers were the early and initial missionaries. Yes, they sow the seeds, and these seeds come in the form of ideas that would be revolutionary in nature. It would change your conception of the world. It would revolutionize your conception of yourself. It would revolutionize your understanding of life. All these things happen. And the tillers, yes, the tillers are those who come in the later generation to ensure and to check what the previous generation had done, to re-standardize it, or rather to standardize it. Of course, this can only be done, as a metaphysical principle. We know that an organized principle, or rather an organized conclusion, can only come from an organized principle. How the Malay archipelago can formulate all these pesantrens and the pondoks is not by mere process of trial and error, but rather because the missionaries who came here are none other, as would be revealed in the coming chapters, than those coming from the household of the Prophet, and those who, having perfected the system over generations, and the source is ultimately revelation. Yes. So the Malay language, now being one of the family languages of Islamic languages, made its mark in history, because you see, between the 12th and the 16th, and then between the 16th and the 18th and 19th centuries, a new civilization was taking place. You see new works being written, and some of these works are so beautiful. I remember some of our friends and our teachers, like Sheikh Abu Zaki, when he was in Tarim, when he was in Hadramaut, he was tasked with teaching some of the converts. Some of the converts were British people, and he would teach them using the text of the Malay scholars. Yes, he read it in Malay and translated into English and taught them. And one of the things I remember that was remarked by some of these people was that they said, "We didn't know this, yes? We didn't know that your people house such beautiful treasures." Remember, when our ancestors came, and the British said, a few centuries ago, they came for the spices, and they came for the natural commodities and resources. Yes. And while they overpowered us because they developed their technological and military sciences, yet what they did not know was that these people had produced such beautiful writings on the nature of the spirit, on the nature of the soul, on the nature of the intellect. Yes. And that is why I remember what Professor Zaini said and what he had written in the preface of his Makna Kebahagiaan, translating one of the works of Professor Al-Attas. He said, one of the biggest lessons, or one of the greatest treasures that he owed Professor Naqib, his teacher, was that he was taught by Professor Naqib how to look at our predecessors with respect. Just looking at them with respect, just looking at them in a corrected view would change who we are, would allow us to become better people. And with that, I think I have ended my 10 minutes. I give it to the MC.